Well, very good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much to everyone who's invited me, to Charlie and to Fabrice, Jean-Charles as well. All I can say is you poor things getting me first thing in the morning. Too much, too soon, too fast. I had a long think about what on earth to do in terms of actually, now, can I go forward? Oh, no, it's back. There we are. Always work. How I was going to get myself in the mood for this and how to sort of warn you about what you are going to get this morning. And I'm really quite into films, and I love action films, and I thought, I know, that's what I need to watch and think about. Any of you have ever enjoyed Scarface, as I've done? This kind of gives you a warning of what's going to happen over the next hour, really. It's going to be extremely provocative. Before I do get a bit, fighty, let me just start by putting a few points out there that I just want to make absolutely clear when I start criticizing things. First of all, I am not arguing about the beauty of the amazing research that's been done, about the amazing trials that have been done. I'm a fundamental biologist as well by background. When I did my PhD, I did in calmodulin. I love calmodulin. I could bore you senseless about it. None of that I'm going to argue about. I'm not going to argue about anything about the importance of medicines in the control and cure of many types of cancers. And I'm not going to say anybody doesn't want imprecise medicine. What I'm going to actually talk about a lot and argue about is that the way we're doing things and the trajectories we're going on are not going to lead to some sort of utopia. So what about issues and tensions, I think, that cross boundaries? And these are just 4 general slides, just to give you a flavor of what I'm going to talk about. The first is cancers, the pinnacle of global health mountain. We bang on about precision medicine, but I think it's really well worth remembering that when it comes to cancer care, whether you're talking about in this country, whether you're talking about Europe or generally across the world, we're talking about the top of the global health mountain. And down here are all the social determinants in the South Col. Up here are all the big fundamental pillars of surgery and pathology and therapeutics. And cancer, if you like, has to build on all these foundations. If you haven't got a strong healthcare system, you cannot, by definition, have strong cancer care. And then people say, well, where's precision medicine? Well, it's the small Norwegian flag right at the top. And that is just the reality of where we are today. So again, when we're talking a lot about, where does precision medicine fit into global health and into global cancer control, this is really, at the moment, the fine-tuning of the fine-tuning right at the top. The other thing is you'll all be delighted to hear this. There's a paper coming out very soon that we've just finished showing that actually cancer research now is the biggest single human research endeavour in history. It outstrips all the astronomy, the moonshot program, the physics, by whatever indicator you want to look at. The amount of publications, the amount of money, the number of people involved in this field. It is absolutely vast in terms of a global field of research. But of course, if you're down here and this enormous amount of research is coming over, it's either a good thing or it's just a whopping great big tsunami heading towards your society and your healthcare system to actually try and manage. And I guess part of the management problem with this from a health economics, from a public policy point of view is this, that in a sense precision medicine and a lot of what we talk about the prevailing dogma of cancer is techno-centric. Don't really talk much about the social determinants and all those other aspects. This is about technology being the major driver of the way we're approaching cancer control and cure. But of course, the reality is it's still very much driven by human-to-human interaction. Now, that's a really important point from an economics point of view. Incidentally, can I just say, never ever do this. Curators get really angry when you start trying to mock up photographs, so I really don't recommend anyone try this. There's also another massive tension, I think, in when we talk about precision cancer medicine and the prevailing dogma, which is the tension between the rights and the needs of individuals with what we need for society. And the two are not necessarily coterminous. We have all these arguments about, well, if you deal with the individuals, then society will benefit. Or the needs of society outweigh the needs of the individual. And these are really fundamental tensions, and they're fundamental tensions in public policy, and they're fundamental tensions across the piece. And this has been going on for years and years. Actually, Tocqueville, in his amazing piece of work on American democracy, worried that the frontiersman-like mentality of the Americans would one day mean that their individual wants and need would outstrip their rights and responsibilities towards society. And you can argue in many cases now, the needs of the individuals are outstripping or are trumping what we need for society. So these are three things, and these are the three blocks I'm going to break into, and then I shall pause after each one. I'm going to talk about context to precision medicine and why I think the context is so important and why I think that perhaps things are unbalanced, or rather seriously unbalanced. We're going to talk a lot about money, the economics and the economic impact. And I'm going to end with talking about power, and that's either the power to change things or the power to control trajectories. So context is everything. So a quick short history lesson. Hippies, 1960s, fantastic. Once upon a time, science was just left alone. It was just, pre-1960s, it was just expected that if you put money into research and you carried out research, it would eventually have a public good. And then in the 1970s, people started getting a little bit angsty about all this, and particularly the Americans started worrying that all this public money was actually not being translated into any sort of competitive advantage. And they saw the post-war economies like Germany rising. They got increasingly worried about the competitiveness against Russia. And, for instance, with universities and public sector, if you had federal money, that invention had to go back to the government. And at the time, before Bayh-Dole Act came in, something like 28,000 patents were owned by the US government, of which only about probably 5% had been used. So these two chaps, Barr and Doyle, Indiana and Kansas senators, put forward a proposal to amend the patent law, which essentially allowed universities, private sector, receiving federal funding to take that money, have an invention, and then license that invention out. And it fundamentally changed everything because it became about the commercialization of science. It became about seeing science not through the lens of public good, but about generating money. And this is 1980 when this act came into force. And it's interesting because we're always well behind the Americans. The reality is, Europe, in fact, you can go back and look at this old paper that was in memory of Tom Connors. We don't see anything really hitting the shores of Europe until at least the 1990s, mid-1990s. But after that, there's an exponential growth in venture capital, spin-outs, biotechs, and many of you were part of that early revolution in Europe. But this has happened quite quickly. When it comes to economic and societal terms, the 1960s today is not a long time for societies to adapt to these sorts of changes. And it's really quite a complex interface when you're trying to study this, as we study health systems, research systems. I'm a surgeon by background. You have to use a lot of different disciplines to try and understand why we've reached where we are and whether or not you can intervene going forward into the future. And a lot of these are historical contingencies. They are what they are. Or they're about legislation and regulation for which nothing we can do very little about. But what we do know now is if you look at all the research, and it doesn't matter what domain, lung cancer, breast, whatever, something like 76.4% of all activity, funding, and research outputs is now concentrated in the work that you're all talking about over these couple of days. That is how dominant the paradigm is. And actually, the emergence of personalized medicine, drug development paradigm, the molecular targeting, etc., has been incredibly rapid. If we look, this is just a way of looking at papers and outputs of papers. If I'd have shown you this 15 years ago, you would have seen a broadly clinical and a very basic area. And by clinical, I mean regimen A versus regimen B, for instance. No biomarkers, no real science behind it. Standard, old-school therapeutic trials. And you would have seen a lot of biomedical research going on down here, the beginnings of cell signaling movement, etc. What's happened is this development of this huge translational or experimental medicine space that's occurred. But it's happened unbelievably quickly in terms of scientific progress. This is an enormous problem for societies. You've got to deal with this from a regulatory point of view, from an economic point of view. So the societies in public policy terms are having to catch up with this. And there's a reality, and the problem is we don't sell this, in my view, to the public very well at all, not even sell it. We don't say this to the public, which is actually there's no linear relationships between scientific progress and outcomes. Many people think there is. We put more money in and we get better outcomes. That is absolutely not true. And I could spend hours showing you data after data to show, actually, this is much more stochastic than people want to admit. But we sell it as linear progress. And if you look at most of the reports, the way we discourse this in the public domain, we sell this as linear progress. The other problem, I think, is the structural and political and fiscal inequalities that we get across Europe and globally are wide, and they are widening. You've all seen this data before, I'm sure. This is Eurocare 5 survival data from Europe. Individual site-specific cancers, 5-year survival. This is the best performing country. These are the worst performing countries. So look at this testicular. You've got 2 countries there that have those 5-year survivors. And it doesn't matter, I can show you age-standardized mortality rates. The gaps are equally large. I mean, this is deranged breast cancer. We've still got 20% difference in survival across Europe in one of the most treatable types of cancers. Testicular, 30% difference. Okay? These are enormous. And they're actually getting bigger from the data we have at the moment. And just to put it into context in an emerging economy, because Charlie asked me to talk about it, this is India, and data from emerging economies on survival is really difficult to get. It's pretty poor, actually. A lot of it's modeled. But in breast cancer in India, we've got it. Now, this is the range of the best outcomes in terms of breast cancer to the worst. And actually, this is historical worst. Most women are actually down here in India in terms of their outcomes for breast cancer. And of course, that correlates with poverty, social exclusion, etc. But my point is here, precision medicine isn't going to cure any of this. Having said that, and here's the contra-argument, look at this group down here. And this is a huge problem. Now, actually, you can quite cogently argue from a scientific point of view, the progress that needs to be made against here is entirely reliant on precision medicine, because a lot of the other modalities and the social factors simply aren't changing outcomes at all. We also have this argument about global relevance. Is what we're doing in high-income countries and the dogma around and the focus on precision cancer medicine of global relevance, or as a colleague of mine recently put it, said, it's nothing more than cream for the cream. In other words, the cream of research outputs for the cream of society. And the truth of the matter is, globally, when you're looking at emerging and low-income countries, most healthcare systems are not very stable. This is a fantastic index called the Fragile State Index. It's well worth looking at. It's actually curated by the CIA. Which you do wonder why they do this and what exactly goes into it. But anyway, it's pretty good. 67 countries last year went backwards on this in terms of fragile. The world is not becoming more stable. The world is actually becoming more fragile. And that translates into healthcare systems as well. And precision medicine and equality. We know from a lot of work, and I do admit, people do get antibodies against Joe Stiglitz and people like that, but we know from a lot of work now that where you have political and market forces only sensitive narrow interests, you do get inequality and poor outcomes across the broad range of health outcomes. And there's a real problem here, and people say, well, I'm into precision medicine, but I also want to see better general outcomes. Okay, great. But in public policy terms, we know something called the Olsen effect, and this is it's been proved time and time again. The larger the group, the less it will further its common interest. Actually, precision medicine is a very tight, cohesive group and has got a long, long way in the public and political discourse. The problem is if you try and argue for just general better outcomes, you're having to bring in lots of different people from lots of different, it's a wide group. And the reality is in public policy, it becomes very difficult to argue that because it's a very diffuse argument. So it's strange. On the one hand, we want better overall outcomes. On the other hand, you make much more progress by being very narrowly focused. And the world is becoming more unequal. I mean, this is just a reality. We're seeing increasing indicators showing inequality in most emerging countries and even in sort of high-income countries. Number of billionaires and the net worth as a percentage of GDP. So in the UK, the last time we looked, we have 36 billionaires that controlled or owned 4% of the GDP. And in Germany, that's actually 55 billionaires holding on to 7.2% of GDP. Now, I don't know whether you can argue this is right or wrong, but this is expanding. And of course, poverty and social exclusion rate make a major difference. So when you look at Europe, the interesting about Europe, of course, is, and this is employment rates, you've got to use these indirect indicators. Really you want employment rates in, if yellow, light green, or dark green. If you're into this browns or the reds there, you're in trouble. And none of you will be surprised when you look at this particular picture there. And the last really decent data we had was from 2010. I've looked at recent data, it's getting worse, actually. Now, what this means is, as you know, is a lot of parts of Spain, lots of parts of Greece are economically going backwards at the moment. And what you see, the problem is it's not just the employment and the general inequality, it's whether you have social protection. So look at France, for example. There are lots of parts of France which are quite poor, but the social protection is very good. And that allows societies to work through public policy to be able to afford more high-end healthcare. But where you have brown on brown, you're in real trouble. And that's a point I want to make about Europe, the divergence that's occurring across the EU 28. So that's my first real pitch to you, and it's just to say that, look, there's an extraordinary mosaic of culture, society, contingent histories, political evolutions, even in Europe. It's incredibly varied. All of these shape the dynamics of cancer tectonics, and what we've seen really is this very rapid emergence of what essentially is a hyper-technical paradigm, which has overwhelmed systems and policymakers and distorted a lot of the research landscape. And I pose this question to you, should precision cancer medicine be this dominant? When you think about what the trade-offs are, and assuming that the pie for funding research, for actually funding care downstream, is not going to change. And I'll show you some economic data later to back that up. So, it's just a fundamental question about whether precision cancer medicine should really, and the answer may be yes, we do. We should have it. That's absolutely fine. So I'm going to stop there and just ask you what people think, really. Charlie.
So Richard, what should we spend our money on? Are you suggesting we should spend our research dollars on managing equality across Europe to narrow the gap in those wide deviations in cancer outcomes?
So this always comes down to the argument I remember having at CR UK, which is you just left the money open to the best possible proposals versus there was some sort of management with handing out research funding to different domains. Surgical specific initiatives to support health services research. But the reality is when you look at what's being spent and what's being done, there's not been that much movement. There's lots of claims to, supporting supportive and palliative care initiative. There have been various initiatives looking at improving surgery. But really, when you look at the proportion of effort and money that's gone into those areas, it's very, very small from the major research funding organizations. And a lot of you I know will hold double hats. You'll be there talking about precision medicine, but also about the future strategy of research funding organizations. And I guess I'm going backwards now to my days in CRUK clinical director and saying, is the balance really right at the moment on the prevailing data?
I think everybody accepts this is a very challenging field, but I don't see that as an argument not to invest in it.
Okay. But at the expense of investing in other areas. That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I do get that.
So at what point should research funding organizations start just hypothecating money out and just putting a line and saying, right, we're not funding any more than X% of our budgets on precision cancer medicine, considering how many different funding bodies there are?
I'd like to make a comment.
Ooh, hello.
Hi. So I'm Sarah Copeland. I'm a histopathologist in Liverpool, and I'm also the lead of our Cancer Research Centre. And we have similar maps of the health inequalities actually just within England and also within Liverpool and Merseyside. If you look at, for example, the centre of Liverpool, Liverpool unfortunately is the cancer king of the cancer capital of Europe, particularly with lung cancer. And if you delve into the epidemiology, Merseyside, 2 or 3 suburbs of Liverpool have the highest rate across Europe in terms of incidence of lung cancer and mortality. So I agree with you that there's inequality across Europe. I think we should look at ourselves within England and modify the health system and also the diagnostic tools which are applied across the country. As a pathologist working in the NHS, I know that some of the trusts in England have access to better diagnostic tools than others. And I think this is probably something that you're going to go on to in terms of economics. But how do we address? I mean, I admire also all of these fantastic advances in the technology, but there's a massive gap between the research and introducing this into the NHS, and I can imagine in other health systems across Europe.
Thank you. Yeah. Should I just take another comment and then I'll respond?
Sure. I mean, I should probably preface this by saying I'm ABCAM's collaboration manager, so I'm going to be a little bit antibody biased. But furthering on from that point, it feels like what we're doing is there are further and further advances in technology to actually do the diagnostics, and each of them cost more and more. And it feels like we don't necessarily focus on the previous generations of cheaper diagnostic technology and actually work out what that can do before going on to the more expensive technology. So I feel like we're kind of making a bigger problem for ourselves by making it more expensive without developing fully the cheaper tools that we already had access to.
Yeah, I'm interested in how other people sort of, I mean, there's this perennial problem of, and I'm going to dissect, I think you're spot on, dissect out the issue around the research and care. So we know full well, that lady was saying to me, about, there is just a lack of fundamental decent pathology in many places, for example. Yet, on the other hand, we're talking about introducing some very advanced next generation sequencing and stuff in other centres. Now, some people would say, well, I'm sorry, that's just a paradox you have to live with. That's just the reality of markets. It's the reality of differential development. That's one retort. You can just say, well, tough. I'd look at it the other way around and say, okay, that's fine for the people winning at this end and getting all those and that's just getting all this advanced stuff. It should be the role of somebody within society, be it government or fund or non-government organisations, to ensure that the baseline quality and infrastructure is there. And I guess what I've noticed, and what we haven't got time to talk in today, is data showing you that what's happened, particularly in federal funding across Europe and federal public policy, and that includes the UK government, is the focus has shifted from providing the baseline good quality to the high-end advanced. And that area has kind of been allowed to wither a bit and ignored from a public policy point of view. So, sir, sorry, I'm yakking on. Please.
No. Okay. Alberto Bordelli, Italy, Torino. So fascinating. I have a comment and a question. Something that struck me from your presentation so far is the nonlinear correlation between how much money you inject and the outcome. And public funding in Italy sort of ran out about 10 years ago. I don't have any data to back this up except my witnessing it. And in fact, I think it did good to science in Italy overall, because it sort of exterminated a land of poor quality professors that were just there sitting. Now, the question that comes is the following. Have you a way to measure, like by region, whether the input of funding results in better science or not? Because that would be incredibly interesting.
Yeah, brilliant. And I have to be a little bit careful because I don't want to blow the lid on something we've been doing. It's been very hard to find a natural experiment, but we found one in the UK. I'm not going to tell you what site-specific cancer it is or what initiative it was, but we found, and in basically a whole load of people saying there's not enough money in this area. You need to put money in. Money went in, a lot of money went in, and there's made not a blind bit of difference to trajectories. Now, a whole load of qualitative research, what it did do is people started buying much more expensive kit. And actually, by the looks of it, started doing a lot less productive research. So the money just went into a sponge. It just didn't do anything. So there's absolutely no doubt the correlation between productivity and putting money in is, but we've only got one example. I won't, come and talk to me afterwards and I'll tell you privately what it is. But that's...
Yeah, just a comment. I believe that the precision in your precision cancer medicine does not cost a lot, which is the cost is really the pharma and the drugs.
Yeah.
The precision aspect has no cost, almost.
Yeah, I'm going to, thank you. I'm going to show you some data on the cost of precision in a minute. Thank you for teeing that up, because I agree with, part of me agrees with you in terms of the precision. I'm going to show you the data about the cost of drugs and the pricing and the way the structure. I think you're spot on in saying that, by the way. Yeah.
So, Richard,
Yeah.
I would like to take advantage that we have Fabien Calbo, who did run during 7 years the whole research envelope of French NCI. So, Fabien, you were at the power to make decisions. How did you split the money between funding for precision medicine versus care versus immunology? What decisions you made? Can you give us an idea of the splits that were present during your 7 years of dealing with cancer research in France?
We had no impact on drugs, and drug delivery. The only impact we had was on the precision aspect. And the funding of this aspect was very, very low compared to other aspects of research. It was about, let's say, less than 10% of all the investment into research. So that's why I believe that the precision aspect has a very low cost.
I'm confused by I guess I'd expect the investment related to the output to be non-linear, but discoveries are random. So you pour money in, as you said, a sponge, and then it spits out a discovery at a random point. So I guess I'm not surprised that it's non-linear, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, unless you explain differently. And trying to measure it and show it is non-linear and suggest we shouldn't put money in because the discoveries are non-linear, I think would be bad, unless you can convince us otherwise. And I guess in answer to your question about should precision medicine be this dominant, one of the outputs will be lower cost healthcare. And it's true NGS is enormously expensive, but the ultimate discovery that leads to a clinically applicable tool will probably result in better equality, and that's one of the outputs we strive to achieve. So that's my bias in answer to that question.
No, so I'm not going to reflect on your economic point because I'll come on to that in a second. I think in terms of not being surprised and non-linearity, absolutely. I think it's more the public discourse, the way we describe it. So, when you look at the social scientists who have analysed the way that precision medicine have described themselves to policymakers, politicians, they say, if you give us X million, we will definitely give you Y at the end of it. And that linearity between definitely getting something out and getting the money in is not there. And I understand, don't get me wrong, I understand why it's been done, because actually, nowadays, everyone has to fill in these impact forms. And we know how we look at these and think this is insane. I can't tell you what's going to happen in 10 years from now. We're expected to be prophets in worlds where actually we're supposed to have equipoise, and therefore we're not supposed to know what's going to come out. Do you see what I'm getting at? But we've got into this vicious cycle. But I'll come on to your economics point, which is absolutely spot on, but there's an issue there. I'll take one more and then I'll move on. Thank you.
So, Richard, you mentioned the challenges in funding other areas of cancer research. And I guess this challenge starts very early, because if you're a young oncologist or scientist interested in studying cancer, you're going to want to get into the most sexy science and develop your career into that of course, has been precision medicine for the last 20 years and currently is immunology, potentially.
Right.
And so when it comes to funding research, the very best scientists are going to be in what's been sexy in precision cancer medicine. And so it's very difficult for funders to then decide to fund other areas of science completely, because everyone has been focused on specializing in a different area. So I think, it's hard to say, oh, look, let's just decide to put money into this area of science that's completely different, yes, if actually there aren't the people there who've really spent their lives developing the expertise to try and move in that direction.
Nick's beautiful articulate, absolutely right. And you and I know full well when initiatives are presented with lots of additional money and you haven't done the background work to build up that community, what you get is a whole load of highly substandard applications for research funding, which you think, well, this is not going to go anywhere, now surgery or supportive palliative care, and you end up rejecting. And then people say, well, why on earth are you rejecting this? So you're absolutely right. I guess I'm coming back to for me, it's about doing some sort of research management and planning. But I take your point on that. I'm literally going to take one more comment, and I must crack on. I'm so sorry. I'm just going to So,
I'm not sure I'm going to be able to formulate the question, but I have two questions. The first is, it seems to me that now for economists, the kind of primary endpoint is reducing inequality.
yep.
Intuitively, I thought that it should be to increase the status of the most poor people. It is totally different thing. The second question, in terms of investment, I still believe that investing in very high technology is worth it. The problem is being able to transfer what you have learned from expensive technologies to cheaper technologies that can be affordable for everybody. You know, if tomorrow we make massive investment in whole exome sequencing, in plasma, circulating DNA, etc., then the question is going to be, can we derive some cheap technology that can be affordable for everyone? So I kind of disagree with the idea that research should go to cheap technology. I think it does not exist. It always goes from very expensive technologies, then we learn something, and then it goes to other people.
No, that's an excellent point. So there's a lot of material around scientific technical evolutions in the social science literature and about technology leapfrogging, and also this trade-off between high-end and frugal technology, as though this is some sort of zero-sum game. I guess with a lot of this, it's about the planning aspects. You know, if you're going to put money into X, what are going to be the downstream consequences? But and I agree with you, I don't think any of these are really easy solutions. So thank you for that. I'm now going to talk about money. I always check the pulse of my wallet after my children have got hold of it. Usually you just have to defibrillate it because it's dead. Or intra-wallet adrenaline I also found very, very helpful. Sorry, I couldn't resist that one. They're not here to listen to that, sadly. Cancer, massive, massive, massive pressure on healthcare systems. This is from the Institute of Medicine. It's spot on. It magnifies and exposes all the strengths and weaknesses of what we know about our healthcare systems because it's so complicated and expensive to deliver. I'm going to start making some really big statements here. It is hard to argue against the fact that we should pay for value until you try and pin down whose value counts. This sounds like a bit wishy-washy, but you've got to think, I'm going to explain to you what I mean by this, because I'm going to come to this from a very economist point of view. I'm also going to make the point that at the moment, as far as we can see, there's a total lack of correlation between clinically meaningful benefit and regulatory approval. And we're going to talk about distorted pricing for both brands and generics and why that's the case. Let me build this up. So this comes from JAMA from 2016 and just gives you an idea of what we're getting at the moment in terms of outcomes. You know all this data. 28 oncology drugs, average PFS of 6.1 months. I use the word worse, but particular drugs directed at colorectal, PFS of 0.75, and they still got regulatory authorization from the FDA. And only 12 of these achieved a medium improvement in overall survival. Maybe this is the best we can do and should expect, considering the patients we're treating in these trials. Okay, so that's one of the statements. And of course, on one side of the value equation, and by value I do mean here the money you pay for the outcome you get. It's really quite simple. I'm not going to get into any sort of more complex definitions of what value is. You all know this, and you all know the controversy around this, but in terms of scales, and the way of analysing what we're getting out at the moment is the best we can see. And some work we've been doing as well with colleagues of ours, this gives you an idea of what we've got. Of the 277 randomised clinical trials in the last 5 years, actually only a third of them were designed to meet the clinically meaningful benefit thresholds that were described in this paper. So immediately you're saying, well, hang on a minute, 2/3 were not designed in a way that we're going to even be able to find clinically meaningful benefit? Okay, that's a problem. And then only about 15% of those published actually met the thresholds. This is the 4, 5 and above. I'm sure we're going to have a mass argument about these thresholds. But these were all described, every single one, as management-changing findings. So we talk about hyperbole in the way we describe our findings. All of them changed as management-changing. And the real question is, were they? Now, we don't have any really decent natural experiments about using precision medicines, biomarkers within the real world. The best experimental model we have is the Cancer Drugs Fund. And of course, the genius about the Cancer Drugs Fund when it was set up is it was set up not to follow outcomes. I mean, it's absolutely brilliant. You could not invent something like this. But fortunately, there is ways of retrospectively going back into the data and starting to tear out how the drugs were used, by whom, and roughly what sort of outcomes patients were getting. And just to give you a snapshot, and this will come out later on in the year, basically only about 16% of patients, and what we've looked at so far, had what you consider to have appropriate use. In other words, you look at it and think, really? Yeah, how on earth? Now, this, we're going to argue about this. What's really interesting is these are not the major cancer centers. These are usage outside the major triple Cs. The second problem is only about 14% of those had anything which we could describe as meaningful improvements to outcomes related to that. Now, there's a whole load of problems with the noise, the status of the patients, how sick they were, so there's an enormous number of patients you have to just censor out of this data set. But this is one of the few natural experiments we have about pushing precision medicine into the real world and using it.
Richard, so
Yeah.
can you just say again, so what happened to the 84% who didn't have appropriate use? Can you just tell us what appropriate use means?
So appropriate use means if you look at against guidelines about actually having the molecular test to direct that particular drug, it fits in with the guidelines. So when you look to the patient and you've got 2 or 3 other medical oncologists to make a judgment on that, they sort of have no idea why this patient has been prescribed this particular drug. That's appropriate use. So, and I don't want to go into too much detail about this because I think this is where the argument's going to do, is this appropriate use? But what I'm saying is this is not like everybody's getting appropriate use. Drug prices versus life years gained. So what has been happening over the last few years? First, I want to just have a quick look at this. So this is life years gained on a log scale against, this is thousands of dollars in 2013 data. And it's basically looking at the individual cost, and this is an episode treatment price, which is essentially 1 month's cost, okay? And what you can basically see for the life years gained here, I mean, this is 300,000, 500,000, that's 500,000, okay? This is data, some of these taken from trial, from overall survival, some of these we've had to do through modeling studies. But that's essentially what you see, and look at the range of this. This is incredible. And some of these are up here. I mean, these are astronomical amounts of money that are being spent. Now, the question is, what's been happening year on year? Has this always been like this? So if you go back to the mid-1990s, this is 1996 to 2014, and again, thousands of dollars here, so this is 100,000 up to 400,000. And you look year on year and you plot things out, what you see is a gradual rise with a lot of variation and scatter in this. But this is the sort of thing we're dealing with when it comes to pricing. And I'll come and talk a little bit more about how pricing is done, what people pay for. The real problem with a lot of this is trying to work out what the real prices are and what the real costs are because of rebates and discounts and all sorts of unusual, confidential, often, discussions that go on between the payers and the individual providers. And let me be very clear, it's not just pharma we're talking about, it's negotiations with wholesalers, it's batch purchasing, it's a very complicated area. But in pure economic terms, value, and this doesn't come from me, this is Peter Back's phrase, is crashing. So most of us who look at this data, the economists in the States like Peter Back, etc., everyone just says, look, the value proposition on the moment is crashing. It is getting less, no matter whichever way we want to cut things. But we have a big problem here because there's no way of rationally looking at a non-economic aspects. So the problem is I've given you a very hardcore economist point of view here. But of course we know that actually inventing, for instance, I remember in lung cancer when the first EGFR inhibitor, TKIs, came out, this was a major, major thing for lung cancer, for pushing forward the research in lung cancer. Temozolomide for brain cancers. You know, I was part of the group at CRC working on that. This was a big thing. It wasn't wildly good, but it was a big thing in pushing forward the zeitgeist of research in this area. We just don't have a way of monetarizing the value of these sorts of progressions to the wider elements of society and research. So at the moment, we look at this purely through an economic lens. So why is this happening? First of all, you need to follow the money. It is all about money, unfortunately. The first thing is there is a huge lack of competitive pressure. None of what I'm saying is this is all in the public domain. There's vast amounts of economic literature, stuff in health affairs. It's enormous in the last 3 or 4 years publications. There's a huge lack of competitive pressure. There's very elastic pricing. and there's incredibly opaque reimbursement systems. When you look at compound annual growth rates of individual drugs against market shares, they're very substantial. But precision medicine is the driver on these returns of expectancy. It is about the molecular targeted era. And I do understand why this is the case. Now, just take a look at this. This is sales from the top major countries. These are in millions, so this is sort of 120 billion at the top. Cardiovascular all the way to gastroenterology. Most areas now in the pharmaceutical industry are flatlining. In fact, cardiovascular is starting to come down now because of the interventional radiology, the use of statins. This is oncology. This is oncology going up. Okay? This is extraordinary. So why is this happening? This is when things that some people are going to be going, what? I can't believe we're going to talk about this. My view, it's a highly destructive business model we've ended up in. It's called maximizing shareholder value. It is all about, have you seen that film called, what's it called? The Big Short. Has anyone seen the film The Big Short? No. Oh, watch it. It's fantastic. It's about the collapse of the housing market in the USA and the reasons behind it. And it's all about money and how we handle money and how we increase shareholder value when the value may not be there set at the true level. Now, the thing is, there's a trick that companies do, which is they buy their own stock. These are stock buyback options. And basically, what they're basically doing is buying your own stock. You're using your own money to buy your own stock and therefore inflate the value of your particular company. This goes on across the board, by the way. But look at this. Over the last few years, S&P 500 index, 19 companies, 226 billion repurchasing own shares. I'm not going to go into this in great detail. Read this paper. Read this paper. It's in the Harvard Business Review, so this is really kosher stuff, okay? And it's by an extremely smart economist, and you need to lead smart economists who can explain this, which is Bill Lazonick. He's done a lot of work on this sort of thing. It says, look, the fundamental problem isn't with precision medicine. It's not with the research we're doing. It's none of that. It's not even with pharma and the research they're doing. It's the business model on which we run a lot of corporations, which are these shareholder buybacks, inflating things. More money comes into the system, and we need to continue to make more money. And it's a really nice, and what he does is in this paper, he debunks all the myths that this is the right way to approach things. And it's interesting, because I've talked to a lot of sort of senior CEOs and people, and everyone gets really, they think this is a problem as well. And I'd be interested to know whether there are people out there who work in this particular area. But it's interesting, when you get into the money men and the money women, how many people are starting to panic about the fact this is just overheating things. So the disconnection between health economics and outcomes leads to extraordinary health systems impact, and all this data stuff we've published here. The range that's spent on cancer medicines as a percentage of cancer budgets is all over the place in Europe. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense at all. In some places, 5.4% of their budget just treating on hemato-oncology in one country, you know there's undertreatment. You know there's underuse. In other places, there looks like there's massive overuse. The point is, the budgetary impacts in individual member states across Europe are all over the place. This doesn't make any rational sense and connection. And it's not just medicines. I mean, I'm sorry, this is a medicines meeting and molecular pathology. I want to give a hard time to surgery and radiotherapy. Really? They are merrily getting, in a sense, I feel sorry for medicines because you're above the radar, biomarkers, and so everyone can look at that. What's going on with Da Vinci robots, high-end technologies in surgery, high-end radiotherapy is equally interesting from an affordability point of view. And just look at something like colorectal costs. Actually, in colorectal, it's the in-hospital costs, the costs of surgery, radiotherapy, keeping your patients in for 6 days whilst you're doing radiotherapy, not treating them as outpatients, for example. There's all sorts of bizarre reasons why the inpatient costs are so massive. But then you flick it onto something like breast cancer. And by the way, these are euros, correct for euros. You really are looking for like. And the medicines expenditure is all over the place. I mean, some countries like Romania, look at that. I mean, just doesn't make any sense at all. It just doesn't, I mean, it's just off the radar. I keep using the phrase like off the radar because I don't know what else to say. And people say, well, Richard, it's all right. We put money in and you get better health coming out. Breast cancer, okay, traction on breast cancer. Overall healthcare costs, I'm not just looking at medicines here, Changes in breast cancer mortality over the last 20 years. Improvements? Not an improvement, 0. EL, by the way, is Greece, and then we have Romania, Bulgaria, and all the way through there. And as you can see, you know, this is the cost per incident by total case, sorry, by prevalent case. It's all over the place here. It's just not the correlation that we expect. And of course, you get something like Greece, which is this complete outlier. So again, it's a mess. And in fact, it's an inverse relationship when you look at certain site-specific cancers. So this is the case fatality rate for prostate cancer against expenditure. And look at that. It goes the opposite way. The more you spend, the worse your outcomes are, according to this graph. Nice one. And the reason is purely because of the massive over-expenditure on medicine. It's uncontrolled. Now, this is not a precision medicine problem, but the problem is precision medicine gets dumped into this. It's a problem of governance, it's a problem of financing, it's massive escalation of prices by wholesalers, by individual institutions, and by doctors in those countries. And a lot of macroeconomic data hides really serious site-specific policy issues. And again, if you look at the big things which are driving cancer costs, blood cancers, colorectal, breast, and prostate, you know, these are the ones we really focus on. Lung cancer premature mortality, it's 50% of the economic burden. It's absolutely colossal in terms of economic burden in Europe. And then you get breast, lung, colorectal have huge still informal care costs to individual families when you look across Europe. So this is really quite nuanced data, trying to dissect out the public policy aspects. But what are the trends in the EU? I think we're really near saturation. If we're not, we've gone over. So this is what we've basically been spending across the year. This is the best data we've got from 1995 to 2014. The blue is the direct health cost. Sorry, these are billions of dollars here. And the green is productivity losses due to premature mortality and morbidity. Okay? And this is very nicely censored. This red indicates the percentage that medicines take up within those overall direct healthcare costs. So the best data we got is from 2005. So the last 10 years, it's gone 11, 17, and it's now crept up from the 2014 data to 21% of direct healthcare costs are now spent on medicines. This is what worries people, the compound annual growth rate. Whilst the direct costs are starting to flatten out, medicines have been growing at 11% year on year in terms of the money that individual systems are putting into this area. But as you can see, we're kind of hitting saturation here. Our systems are actually running out of money to continue to pay for more and more technology. And this is not just medicines, it's high-end radiotherapy, pathology, it doesn't matter what. It looks like saturation points are being reached. And there is a very good reason why that is that actually we have very seriously weak health and cancer systems in Europe. This is the mortality incidence ratio against healthcare expenditure generally across Europe. And this group at the bottom here will be of no surprise to you, and of course everybody in this audience I assume is from this group up here. The weak countries do not have capacities to make rational decisions around value. We've already seen how some of the Benelux countries are ganging up together to do group negotiation for medicine prices in the future. Powerful countries are able to control things much better than weak countries are. So to the more better, to the less weaker. And more widely, precision medicine seems like it's yet another negative pressure on emerging economies. And you know, I have to mention this. This is great. This is the house. This is in Mumbai. I love this. Do you know the House of Fraser in the UK? The House of Diagnostics. I actually went in there. It was very exciting, actually, because there's like a full workup. You know, you're popping out for dinner. You want a full CT scan. You know, it's that sort of place. They're very nice people, by the way. And there's some really nice tech. But this is just unregulated market out there. It's extraordinary. But it's not just unregulated private. You know, there's a lot of the public sector is highly unregulated. I mean, there's no oversight, outcomes it's hard to find, et cetera, et cetera. Rampant corruption, unregulated introduction of loads of different technologies, massive over and underuse. This is bizarre paradox. And also the poor quality treatment that a lot of people receive. So we've got precision medicine and these new molecular targeted agents and new forms of pathology being put into systems which are even more complex and heterodox than the systems we're trying to deal with in Europe. Can healthcare systems which are emerging afford precision medicine? This is, people ask me this all the time. We just don't know. I mean, the answer is we don't know. If we talk to my colleagues from Brazil, etc., the answer is yes, we think we're going to be able to manage it, group purchasing, joint ventures, etc. Very little data on economic impact, but this is one from BMC Medicine from a colleague of mine, Nirumala Bhupati, who looked at outcomes after 1 year from a cohort of, I think it was 100,000 or 10,000 patients across 7 Asian countries. 1 year after a primary diagnosis with cancer, what state were they in? And this is the individual site-specific cancer here. Dead, financial catastrophe means they've lost more than 40% of their, this is the 40% level, so 40% of all their income has just vanished. Alive and no financial catastrophe. The news is, the top line message is about 3/4 of patients are either dead or have experienced financial catastrophe 1 year after a diagnosis of cancer. The problems in many emerging and low-income countries are not ones of lack of precision medicines. They are ones of massive underfunding in healthcare systems and serious issues around governance and delivery of basic health. The Beaumont effect, what we don't, and it comes down to the gentleman's point about the technology here, this is a really important book to read, and I can disagree or agree with it in lots of ways. Bill Beaumont basically said, look, we have a problem here. Healthcare is never going to get cheaper. It's never going to get cheaper because the problem is as follows. It's like a Mozart opera. 100 years ago, you paid your orchestra $1 to play that opera. Today, it costs you 100,000. Same number of people doing it at the same speed. You can't make it any faster. The human costs are going to just go up and up and up, and the technology doesn't reduce the number of people you're going to need to care for your population. So technology just adds on to this. Now, lots of people have argued against Bill, so it's well worth reading his book and then going back and looking at it. But what it says is, look, the cost for healthcare is going to go up because of human resourcing. And by the way, every technology we add on is going to make the situation worse. Where does this go? It goes here. You look at this and you think, oh, shit. This was my Uzbek driver when we used to sort of run around Afghan. It looks insane. It looks like he's just lying there about to be driven over, doesn't it? This is actually incredibly rational behavior. It's really, really cold. Now, the engines produce an enormous amount of heat, and they all sussed out that by lying on the wheel there, you could have a really good kip and stay warm. So I kind of guess you look at things sometimes and you think this is deranged, but behind it, there's rationality going on. That's what I'm trying to get at. And this is my sort of, my talking point for the last bit, really. I'm going to say a very brutal thing, which is at the moment, it's unaffordable in an unsustainable manner. The trajectory we cannot keep going, doing the research we're doing, and then dealing with the prices and the costs and the budget impacts that we're getting out of this. I see very little evidence of mutuality and solidarity. Strong countries negotiate better, and they leave the weak countries to flounder, basically. So we negotiate fantastic rebates on stuff for Oncotype DX, etc. Tough luck on anybody else. Weak political coherence in public policy, and inequalities are worsened by allowing market forces to determine structures. Tell me I'm wrong. Charlie. Well, tell me, more point, what do we do?
So I have to confess I don't understand a fair amount of the economics behind any of this. So 2 questions. First of all, when you buy an Apple Mac in the US, or let's say Hackney or Paris, the price difference is plus or minus 10%, maybe 15%, and a lot of that is due to local sales tax issues and what have you. Why is it that there is allowed to be this massive disparity in the cost of medicines, diagnostics, that don't apply to, buying a computer or anything else for that matter?
Well, firstly, I'm sure the US colleagues in the audience, one is the regulation, the ability to negotiate prices. It is extremely variable. So part of this, the problem is reimbursement and pricing negotiation depends on the structure of your system, whether you can do it centrally, whether it's a mixture of healthcare insurance companies negotiating, whether you're legally allowed to within the confines of the country. Peter Back was here, he'd tell you about the woes and ills of the US system and the ability to negotiate better pricing. But generally speaking, regardless of which country you look at, whichever discounting and rebates you're seeing, everything's been going up because the initial reference price is geared to what came before.
Yeah.
And even if it starts low, it goes up. So the papers I described to you there, imatinib's quadrupled. Generics have increased. I saw some data the other day about the increase in tamoxifen prices. I mean, extraordinary. And it doesn't look much as a overall, but actually they've been going up.
Yeah.
So, we have this real problem. It's enormous heterogeneity in the pricing structures due to national legislation, and then the ability to negotiate prices. And I think this is why the Benelux countries are getting together as a group to do this massive group negotiation to drive things down.
Yeah, makes sense.
I don't, fundamentally it's part of the structure of the way that the privatization, in a sense, of all of this, which is completely normal and completely acceptable, is geared to very high returns on investment.
Yeah.
It's very hard. Nothing we can deal with. That's just a fundamental aspect of capital society.
And my second question is, presumably these share buybacks can't carry on forever. I mean, sooner or later, the companies are going to run out of cash, and they can't keep buying back shares and artificially inflating
They
the
have,
price
and this is the grand argument about whether or not this is another one of these big shorts and there's going to be a collapse. It's a CDO on a CDO on a CDO, or that at some point it is going to go on forever. And I use the word forever. You're right. There has to be there will be a restructuring.
Capitalism will win through eventually, won't it?
Sorry again?
Capitalism will win through eventually. I mean, the strong will survive and the weak will fold. A weak company can't keep buying back its shares if it's not delivering productivity.
And I guess that's
output.
the thing. That's what we're all. It's funny. I went to a meeting recently with a whole load of venture capitalists who all just went, we're just going to wait for the train to come off the tracks. What? And they went, it'll come off the tracks eventually, and then the companies which have really got valuable products, we'll deal with, and those that haven't and actually aren't delivering value will implode. The problem is it's a very poor way to manage the fruits of research, because there's an assumption the market will only bring forward things which have real value. There'll be lots of stuff which will get nuked, in my view, which actually may have value.
Yeah.
In very, in particular rare cancers, etc., which we could end up losing because the development pathways implode.
Yeah.
So there's much more nuances to this. I get very worried about unmanaged capitalism in that sense. And I'm not, before anyone else, I'm not a raving hairy Marxist, okay? I look like one, but Jeremy Corbyn, sorry, no, I like Jeremy, but anyway. I do like him. He's kind of a nice guy. Good, I can't, sir. Oh, close.
I a little bit disagree with your slide about surgery and radiation therapy, because, for example, when you are in France, okay, if you spend 1,000 euros in surgery radiation therapy, this money goes back to the society. And this is for the salary of nurses, surgeons that will spend money in buying, everything. For the drug, this is money that is going outside the country. So I think it's a little bit unfair to compare the expense between something that is going back to society and something that is going totally outside.
All right, I agree with you, and my but caveat here is, what I'm trying to get at, maybe I wasn't very articulate there, is something like, for example, the introduction of Da Vinci robots and the speed those have got in. My current colleague's obsession, are radiotherapists in this audience? Proton beam therapy. We'd have a discussion about the utility and just the amount of PBT that's being built at the moment, particularly in the US. And I guess what I'm trying to do is the idea that there are lots of aspects of those weird and bizarre differentials between direct costs, which are to do with strange practices. There are certain countries which love bringing their patients in, when they should be outpatients, and that radically increases the cost. So you're right about that. It's just I'm talking about very specific technologies. So.
Stefan Raum, I'm a clinical oncologist. I was just wondering whether one reason why we spend so much money in so-called precision medicine is an advertisement problem, because when I'm looking at your slides, most expenses seems to have been realized with bevacizumab, for instance, which is targeted therapy, but certainly not precision medicine, as we can just juice up like nearly any cancer treatment with a very low survival benefits. So precision medicine of what we're talking in here would be the exact opposite. We'd have subgroups we could treat very efficiently, like with imatinib. Now, what we're being sold, I think, since 10 or 15 years is so-called precision medicine, when in reality it's not.
Yeah. No, I'm afraid I would entirely agree with you. There's a disconnection between a lot of narrative. And the last bit I'm just going to do, which is going to be very short, will touch on that point exactly.
So, hi Richard, fantastic and very, very thought-provoking talk. So I've read The Big Short, so I would advise everybody to read it and go see the film because it's actually a fantastic film. The problem with making analogies to The Big Short is that, in a sense, what was shown was the capitalist economic system was too big to fail. So it was paid out by the governments of the world, rescued the situation that bankers had selfishly produced by betting on big shorts, the subprime mortgage market in the US. So I would be careful about making these analogies because perhaps that's what will happen with precision medicine and the cost of medicines, okay? Now the second point I'm going to make is to talk about the brown countries, the light brown and the dark brown countries, which you followed through the colors in your slides within Europe. So, talking to people in the brown countries, I'll call them that, not naming the countries, the oncological healthcare economy is shot. Talking to consultants working in one of those countries, if they can't get the ordinary cancer drugs in the hospital on the day when the patient needs it, they tell the patient to go out to the black economy pharmacies that ring the hospitals, go buy the drugs. Right. Bring them back, we'll give them to you. So that is the extent within Europe under which those brown countries are operating their oncology services.
Right. Ella's spot on. It's interesting because we're also looking at what the long-term consequences may be for patient movement across Europe in terms of cancer patients deciding they're not getting the treatment and moving. We're already seeing that with childhood cancers. So children from Bulgaria and Romania moving into the high-income countries to get treatment. So this can have massive effects, but that's absolutely spot on. Charlie, would you want another 15 minutes and then... I'm going to whip through and just talk about the power of hyperbole, because everyone's wanted to talk about this. There's also, I think, a disconnection between the way that we talk about precision medicine and what's advertised. And a gentleman was absolutely spot on. I mean, more and more studies coming out showing this. Now, this is not, part of this is the problem about the way we do, and I say we, our institutions write our press releases. Part of this is about the problem of then selling ourselves. It's about the editorial policies of individual newspapers. It's about the fact that a lot of journalists are rank idiots and don't understand what they're writing about. And don't do proper investigative journalism. And what that means is they just soak up whatever they're told. They just write whatever they're told. But there is a massive disconnect at the moment with the public understanding of precision medicine, in my view, and the reality of where we are and what we are delivering. And that will come back to bite us on the arse, literally. There is a ton of stuff working from the social scientists about the regulatory environment, about moving stuff quicker and quicker into the clinic, and about why this has happened and what's driving this. The problem is, what we see is here a much greater willingness to embrace uncertainty, little responsibility for the economic research or social consequences of decision by either the EMA or the FDA. And it means, in my view, the research world is being pushed into the real world very quickly. More and more stuff is just being moved into the real world. The problem is all this evidence being built up, it does feel a bit like a Greek chorus. You know, you can comment on it, you can write all these papers, you can look at these amazing books, but really, you know, the main actor there is what's going on. I mean, they're not affecting things at all. This is just happening. And I guess, you know, I look at all this and I think to myself, okay, what's happened? You know, strip away and say, why are we in this situation? I think we've been lousy about imposing socioeconomic studies in clinical trials and studies. I mean, once upon a time, we wouldn't have dreamt of allowing studies to come through without having embedded biological studies. We still quite happily wade through studies that have no way of looking at what the social and economic consequences are, because research funders don't ask for it. We continually demand greater access without spelling out the downsides. It's all about access and not about responsibility and the downstream consequences. And we also have this systemic failure to highlight pricing problems because in a sense it's so big and so difficult we don't know what to deal with it. So the default now is that we get away with nudging things. Everyone says, oh, we're going to nudge behavior. This is Conrad Lorenz, by the way. You know this imprinting business? If you stand with ducks and they imprint on you, they just follow him around. And then they follow him into the kitchen. And then there's a nice big pot there, salt and pepper. So there's a lot of interesting stuff around default options here from JCO and lots of excitement about this. There's no evidence nudge works whatsoever. And I guess I say to people, let's assume the nudge business, that we can't nudge behaviors, we can't nudge systems. You know, what do? Do we get engaged with this sort of a Leviathan aspect? The fiscal current, I think, are just huge, and determinants of trajectories, good and ill. There's a lot of stuff we just don't have any control over because they're so big. And it's impossible to know, I think, what radical shifts will occur. I don't see the market as very self-correcting. I think there needs to be much greater value for more cancer technologies. And a focus on better systems. And I guess counterinsurgency warfare, I had to put this in. What can and should we do with this thing? I mean, trying to fight these sorts of problems head on doesn't really kind of work. You've got to go around the sides and come up with a bit of creativity. Changing and challenging the normative research paradigm, journal editors, research funding organizations, what sort of trials are designed to show meaningful benefit? Socioeconomic studies embedded. And also, I think, challenging public perception. Media and patient organisations have an extraordinarily distorted view of what's going on, and we've been lousy at correcting this. I think from the individual behaviour thing, what we claim we're doing and what we do in terms of our research is as important. We might look at these things and well, these are far too big for us to deal with. But actually, as an individual level, there's an awful lot we can do. And many of you sit in very, very significant and senior positions. And I guess this is my last slide. You know, if we don't do something about this, I personally think at the moment the economics and the societal impact is not matching up with what we're doing in precision cancer medicine. We're going to end up looking like this. This is a picture of me when I was younger. So delusional. We're going to end up as a collection of precision supermodels, basically. Lovely to look at, very expensive, affordable to only a few, and of no real value to society as a whole. And I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed.